All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tyler Carter with NuView Trust. We'll give it just another minute or two for all of the attendees to enter the webinar. Kind of a little housekeeping before we begin. If anyone has any questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat or Q&A box, and we'll address them as they're relevant. All right. Well, I suppose we'll get to it, and I wanted to make sure that this is a webinar that we record because I get a lot of questions about the subject where, Jeff, you're an expert. I'll introduce, I guess, both of us. I'm Tyler Carter, again, with NuView Trust. You know, we're a custodian for alternative investments, and we've started this series of webinars based on a lot of feedback that we've received from the advisor IBD community, as well as clients. You know, everyone's interested in alternative investments. We've had people on to talk about a myriad of subjects, but we haven't had anyone on board who's been able to cover impact investing. And that's why we're fortunate to have Jeff Shafer with us today. He heads up Common Good Capital, has more than 25 years experience in the alternative investment space. And I had the privilege of having lunch with him a couple of weeks ago. And it dawned on me that he's an expert in something where most of us probably aren't, and I thought we'd all benefit from his knowledge base. So with that in mind, Jeff, tell us a little bit about yourself. I think we'll start at square one, about you, about Common Good Capital. And then, you know, while you're doing that, if you could share a little bit about the specifics of impact investing as opposed to just socially responsible investing. You certainly set me straight. I know everyone wants to learn more.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you allowing me to be on and talk about something that I'm very passionate about and frankly dedicated the second half of my career to. So let me just give a little background, at least so people can understand where I'm coming from in this discussion. And then I won't answer all your question right now, but so we'll kind of go back and forth. So jump in whenever you want. So obviously you are here just outside of Orlando, Florida, which is where I too am located. So I don't know how many are calling in from this area, but there is a large asset manager on the alternative space here in downtown Orlando, where I had a nearly 20-year career with them called CNL. And we put together all different types of real estate funds. We did some private credit funds and some private equity. But when I was 40, so about 7 years ago, I was an executive with them. And I'll try to make this a quick story, but I had a back surgery and woke up after that back surgery. And I won't go through all the details. I just kind of saw the world different. And it was probably about 2 months later. In fact, I imagined that NuView, you actually work with this. I don't know if you and I have even had this discussion before, but there's a local group here called Elevation. There's actually two elevations here locally, but one of them specifically does affordable housing. And so I've known the CEO and a number of the people at Elevation. And so they handed me a prospectus, which was, in this case, was actually on a DVD. And I remember sitting on my couch, you know, recovering from back surgery, just seeing the world different, recognizing that, man, I was 40, do I want to wake up when I'm 60? And is this the way I want to feel? And the light bulbs went off. I got to see, obviously, not only the unique attributes in this example that affordable housing could deliver from a return perspective, but equally important was I saw firsthand what capital, coupled with a management team who is focused on not only driving that economic return, but also social, environment, and other returns, the impact that I had on the residents and the community. And that's when the light bulbs went on for me. And I was like, okay. I mean, and by the way, it wasn't all this perfect because it was a struggle. It took me a while, but I realized, wait a second, if I can invest in things that I believe in that are going to make money and do good at the same time, it became a no-brainer for me. And I want to relay one thing to you. Specifically, I remember two of the residents were on this little video, and it was probably 30 seconds each. And there's a couple phrases that they said as they were talking about what it was like living in those communities prior to and then post this group coming in, freshening it up and putting management into care. And some of the words that I still hear today is, they've given me my dignity back. I'm excited for people to come over to my home. Recognize it's not a home in the sense like you and I think of, it's an apartment, but they viewed it as their home and the community that they have. And so that forever changed my trajectory. And then made the tough decision to leave. In fact, people thought I was crazy. If you go back 7 years ago or 6 years ago when I finally left, I mean, I definitely was interested in the space, definitely was excited about it. It is still in its nascent stage. So, I mean, I remember talking to the CEO who I directly reported to, and it's like, what are you doing? And now, fast forward today, we'll get into that. I mean, we're hearing discussion all the time from advisors and investors who are trying to figure out how do they start to do this in their portfolio. So last thing I'll say though, and then you can ask any other questions along those lines. So what is impact investing? It's actually just what I described to you. It is investing with this idea of trying to generate a return. And just for clarity, you can have impact investing that is market rate. So you're trying to generate the same market rate returns that you would generate, whether there's an impact component or not. Or you will also see the type of impact investing where it is, they call it, not several names for it, but mission first, or it's another way to say it, it's concessionary. And so one of the distinctions we have to make is the general perception in the US historically has been it's all concessionary. Go outside the US and people are well past that point and recognize that you can not only make market rate returns, but you also can do good. And so, so that's one thing I'd say about impact. The general thing is you will hear terminology about SRI, social responsible investing, ESG, environment, social, and government, and then impact. There is not a uniform way to talk about them. They're all in the same genre, but they're slightly different. So let me just describe to you how I think about them. I would guess that 90% of the industry would say this the same way, but there may be some slight variations. So on the listed security side, so stocks, bonds, social responsible investing, SRI, really, and you can trace this back way, way longer than I'm going to trace it back, but even just go back 30 years ago, it was dominated by ranking stocks by negative attributes. So if you didn't want to invest in tobacco or the sin stocks, that generally was viewed as social responsible investing. One of the leaders in that was Calvert funds in the public security side. Then you saw the integration of what you call ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That would be a similar system where you would rank these companies by a positive metric. Are they, if they're doing well in the environment stage, in the environment, we're going to give them a score, and then social, and then governance. And then you're screening companies not from an exclusionary standpoint. Instead, you create this universe that you will invest in through these ESG screens, and then the portfolio manager goes in and buys from that universe, not the holistic universe. So generally, ESG and SRI are on public securities. Generally, impact, where you're not only driving financial returns, but you're actually measuring and trying to influence social governance and some of these other things, that tends to be more private. Now, you can have some private vehicles that use ESG principles, but generally, when you talk about impact investing, that's talked more about on the private side or alternative side, and then ESG is on the public side.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think what you said really kind of helped set it straight, that a lot of socially responsible investing is just what you're not going to kind of condone or invest into, whereas, impact investing is that there's a specific goal that you're trying to accomplish with that investment. Tell me a little bit more. I'm really interested to hear kind of about some different types of investments and trends that are emerging, but touch a little bit more on Common Good Capital, kind of who you guys work with, kind of where you fit in, because I think we'll have a lot of people in attendance that'll probably have questions for you after the fact. If you could cover that a little bit, I think that'd be time well spent.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was at this company for 20 years. We would raise funds that would be $4 to $6 billion. And so when I woke up and recognized that I really want to turn my career into the impact space, I didn't know exactly how to do it. So I started consulting. in the industry and actually work for a company called TriLink Global. They were one of the original impact investors that was at any large scale here in the US. They do invest outside the US mainly. They have some US investments as well, but it's predominantly in private credit and emerging markets. But I worked there for a while and consulted with them to try to really understand the ethos and what goes into a traditional asset manager that then you add impact onto that. So how do they function relative to what I had seen for 20 years? The other thing I did is I traveled all across the country and talked to all these different asset managers. And let me say one other thing to do is before I go in depth on the common good piece, what we view alternatives just like you all probably do. We view it as real assets, generally real estate related, private credit, and private equity. And so I travel around the country talking to all different asset managers who were in those segments, but also had this impact theme. And in fact, my wife and I were starting to make some allocations across those ourselves as we went. In that process, here's what I saw, which will translate into what Common Good does and why do we do it. So as an advisor, if a client comes to you and says, hey, I want to do impact investing, okay, you probably have resources, maybe not great, but you definitely could do some research on public securities, ESG, SRI. But when it comes to the alt space, there really is no place for you as an advisor to go see and research and understand this. And so what we saw that, and here's what we specifically saw too, is there are these asset managers out there who are doing, like I said, real estate, private credit, private equity, mainly institutional. A lot of them wanted to bring their strategies to the RIA community, the financial advisor community, but they didn't really know how. Meanwhile, you have this ever-growing demand from advisors and from their investors. And so we watched people try to connect the dots, and it just hasn't happened to the extent that it should. And there's reasons for that, which I won't go into right now unless we want to. But what we realize is, wait a second, given my background and my team's background, we've been doing alternatives. Like I said, I've been doing this for 20 some odd years. And so let's leverage the relationships, the expertise that we have. And so we have created a platform today where we go and source, we do diligence, we run these different funds and managers through our own investment committee and due diligence process. And to the extent it passes, and we think that there's demand in the marketplace, then we will set up either an advisory type agreement or we will help them with capital raise, essentially connecting financial advisors and these asset managers and these funds. And the way we structured our business is, in 99% of the cases, it does not cost you or clients any more money by the fact that we're involved. Instead, these asset managers, rather than building a big old team and having to learn what we do, they say, hey, we'll pay you out of our own pocket. So we become a resource for advisors if you have interest in the impact space. And so we have a platform of 5 different asset managers, a number of different funds, anything from renewable energy to affordable housing to private credit. And we can help connect you. The other thing is because we're constantly evaluating deals and we clearly can't raise capital for all of them, we're happy to connect you with firms that we've talked to, whether we work with them or not, just as to be a resource for everybody.
Wonderful. Yeah, you touched on kind of renewable energy, affordable housing, and private credit. Could you go a little bit more in depth into kind of some interesting, types of investments that you're seeing, or at least, trends that are emerging?
Yeah. So this is where you could talk for an hour, and I'm trying to also be mindful of just regulatory on this as well. But let me start with this. If you have not heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, or you'll also hear them called the SDGs, put out by the UN, that is often a place where investors will start this discussion. So just type it in the internet, you'll pull up, there's 17 goals that the UN has agreed to. They are big BHAGs, is what you call them. And they're not just investments, but essentially I think like 200 countries have signed up to say, hey, we're going to try to align with these goals. So one of them is eliminate poverty, for example. And there's stuff about clean water. And so I think that gives you a great place to start from, to say, what are the different themes out there? Now, I will tell you, not every theme is investable in a market rate type of return. And that's not the purpose of the goals, because some of it will be non-profit driven. But that's a great place to start, even to take an investor and say, hey, go look at these SDGs. Are there any of them that resonate with you more than others? And then what we have seen is certain advisors in that dialogue, to the extent that they can help them on the investment side with those, that they will. But then to the extent they can't, there's some investors who are saying, look, that's fine. I still would love to figure out philanthropic ways to help in that as well. So now getting to some of the interesting ones, that we get to see some really, really cool deals. And here's what I would say. Unlike what I would have thought 7 years ago, and kind of the general perception is that impact investing is head light and maybe all heart. In fact, I will tell you two of the words that I think of today when I think of impact investing is innovation and creativity. Because these asset managers are trying to solve real problems in a sustainable way, and they're forced to use a different part of their brain and other types of instruments. So let me just give you an example of, and these aren't fund specific, just general ideas or themes. Environment's a big one. Obviously with carbon sequestration, just look at any boardroom today. More and more people are worried about the carbon output. And then you've seen Nike, Amazon, all of them have come out with, we're going to be carbon neutral. So how do they do that? Well, they do that by buying assets that have typically carbon credits or offsets. So one theme specifically is forest land, as an example. There are ways to buy forest land to sell off some carbon credits, which is obviously associated with the timber and the carbon sequestration. And so that's a very creative type of vehicle. In the environmental side, there's also wind and solar. So you can go buy solar farms, and essentially you're collecting, your quote unquote, it's not necessarily this, but your rent payment, so to speak. What happens is there's usually a utility company of some sort that has agreed to buy the power off these solar or wind for X amount of time, and essentially they just pay you that. So that's another one. Organic farming. So I don't know how much you know about organic farming. Growing up in Oregon, we did organic farming. In our backyard, but so I didn't know a ton about it other than just having a garden. But there are opportunities out there where you can buy farmland where the whole strategy is taken from traditional farming to organic farming. Typically, it's a 3 to 5 year process. And in fact, we went to a due diligence meeting on this as we were looking at a firm, and heard the farmers talk, and just the health of the soil that they talk about. And then of course the quality of the food. So that'd be another one. Totally random, kind of off the norm. There's some things called social impact bonds. And I won't go into the details specifically, but I'll say this. There are bonds that one in theory could buy that tries to help with recidivism rate for ex-offenders or formerly incarcerated men and women. And it's a very creative financing tool that essentially, if the recidivism rate stays at a certain level for these group of formerly incarcerated men or women, then you as an investor get compensated for that. Now, the risk that you take, though, is you're paying for the services for them to be rehabilitated during their imprisonment time period. And what that whole thing is doing, it's taking dollars that governments traditionally pay to go in this case, help men and women who are in prison, to try to help them from not coming back. There's very little accountability. So this is a way to create accountability. And as investors, you can get rewarded by it. And frankly, it's government dollars that are paying you, the investor, if you get the results that you want. So again, very creative type of opportunity that are out there. So I could go on forever, but you want more, or is that good enough?
No, I think that's probably good for now. I think one of the exciting things about both of our roles is we're both in positions where we get to see a lot of interesting and exciting deals. I think it's perpetual curiosity that makes both of our roles really interesting.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you sharing those examples. So, what sort of trends are you seeing in the impact space? It's interesting, right? Because usually we're talking about, I don't even know if you would call this a sector or what the proper term would be. Usually we're talking about, multifamily or energy or something like that. But what sort of trends are you seeing kind of specific to the impact space, and what's prompting kind of advisors' interest? And I ask you that because this is something where we're certainly seeing kind of an uptick in questions, conversations where historically, all we really heard about was kind of return profile risk and
Yeah.
so forth. And I do think that there is an increase in kind of the conscientiousness of both advisors and clients, at least that we're interacting with. I'm wondering if you're seeing the same thing or if there's anything you can speak to on that front.
Yeah, and this is, again, we could have a long discussion on this. Obviously, I'm biased. This is where I'm going to spend the second half of my career. This is where I'm putting my own investment capital, and frankly, in common good, I've invested a ton. So I believe in the trends. Not as an ego statement, but I'll tell you, just earlier this week, for example, I talked to a registered investment advisor out in the Western United States. They had an investor who specifically wanted to know about impact. And it was interesting hearing him introduce me to this scenario, because he basically said, look, Jeff, you were ahead of this. You were talking about this 7 years ago. And well, I wasn't, and I didn't know that it's all going to be where it is today. But I mean, just to hear him say that, because he now has investors specifically are coming to him on the impact space. Here to be some of the trends. Number one, and there's different studies out there, so I'll give you the ballpark. Different studies will show that 80% of women and 80% of millennials, if given the opportunity to invest this way, where they align their values with their investment capital, they would. It makes it sound like men don't care at all. That's not true either, but they're down in probably the 60% range. So that's one thing. There's this increased demand from specifically women and millennials. There's another massive trend that's underway, and most advisors are aware of this. And again, there's differing numbers out there, so we'll just talk about huge capital, is this whole wealth transfer. So if you think about this wealth transfer that's going to happen over the next 20 to 30 years, symbolically going from the male figure to probably the spouse, and then from the spouse down to the children. And so given just the demand at the women and millennial levels and the flow of capital that's going to come their way, the trends are absolutely huge. So that would be one overarching thing that I would say, which has been in place for some time. Here's something else that we have seen happen dramatically just this year. And it doesn't matter what political aisle you're on. Given what's happened with COVID, given what's happened with just the social unrest, the political unrest, the racial unrest, I think people are at a boiling point, and they really want to have action. And so it's funny, one of the reasons why, in fact, we just had this discussion here in my office with the team just yesterday. One of the awesome things about impact investing is, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're libertarian, whether you're Republican, when you invest in, you pick it, affordable housing, renewable energy, whatever, you're part of the solution. And not only that, you're actually taking risk to do that. And so there's a real ownership and buy-in. So I hate to say it, but I think this year has been a big catalyst for this idea of socially responsible ESG impact investing. And I don't see that changing. Whether Trump wins, whether Biden wins, guess what? People know that capital has power, and people want to be a part of that in a positive way. So that's those are some of the things that we see.
Yeah, I think that's pretty slick. The statistic that you said about 80% of people, if they could, kind of would align their investments with their values. And I think one of the big things that I've noticed is that, people are just more aware that that's possible.
Yes.
And the other kind of neat thing, you talked about, these investments, many of them not being concessionary, that some of the investments that would be considered impact investments, they don't even necessarily market themselves that way. Right. You hear a lot about, doing well by doing good. And I think that's what's interesting. If it's all things being equal, why not invest into the fund that's going to have some positive impact? So we definitely see that too. And I think that's really insightful about COVID. I think people have certainly spent more time kind of reflecting, and I think poring over their finances. And what are you seeing, that I imagine there's an element of advisors wanting to meet that demand. You talked about demographic shifting and kind of generational wealth transfer. I'd imagine that advisors are kind of compelled to be more knowledgeable in this space, to differentiate themselves from their peers, for their own personal beliefs, and probably because they're hearing it from their clients. What are advisors telling you when you speak to them? Is it something, I know 10 years ago, there was an attitude that, look, they're getting paid for return. It wasn't something that was high on their radar. But I think that's probably changed, and you could probably tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and let me start with one spot that we see it in a massive way. And this tends to be with larger families when they bring in generation 2 and generation 3 into the discussion. I can tell you, I've had a number of conversations with advisors who really generation 2 and generation 3, the main thing they want to talk about is impact investing. But here's what's interesting. What the transition is that not only these families most of them have been philanthropically inclined anyways, but what they've started to notice is that some of the things that they're trying to help philanthropically, when they go to their portfolio, they're recognizing that's incongruent with what they're trying to do over here. And so there's been this awakening to say, hey, when possible, if I can grant or give money to some organization, some cause, and I can invest in it over here, then I'm not only making a return on it, but I'm also then making it more sustainable so I can continue to do more of this. So that is definitely, that's definitely a trend and something that we see in a big way. The other thing I would tell you is, because we talk to financial advisors all across the United States, and I don't mean to offend anybody by saying these statements, but I'll just tell you what I see. So first of all, at the big banks, the Merrill Lynch's of the world, the Smith Barneys, all that, there is big talk and big dollars from a commitment level at that level. The challenge is most of these impact funds are not billion-dollar funds. So these big banks, to get it into the hands of their investors is pretty hard. The next layer below there is registered investment advisors. And just kind of by definition, registered investment advisors tend to have a more open architecture where they can go approve and sign on, in theory, what they want to. And so we have seen, specifically in billion-dollar and up RIAs, this has become very important. Some have a focus on it, have an expertise, have in-house people. Others look to groups like us to help them wade through the different impact alternatives. In the broker-dealer side, it's a little more sparse, although I think that will change. And then, Taylor, one of the things that you said is that actually some of the funds that are out there do have an impact that are already available. They just maybe haven't marketed it very well. And so, for example, we have worked with that they can access it through your, and I won't mention the names, but through your firm. One does mobile home communities, another one does affordable housing, and they each market that impact component slightly different. I would tell you, when you understand what they do, I mean, affordable housing is pretty blatant, but even mobile home parks, I mean, at first blush, you may not think of it as impact, but when you really unpack it and see what they're doing and what they're providing to a community at a certain price level, it's a very competitive and a very important part of the economy. Frankly, in the mobile home community, you actually wish that you could develop more, but there's such a stigma against them, it's hard to, but frankly, could be a very important part of taking care of part of this affordable housing.
Very interesting. I like what you said too about the families that might be making, giving on the philanthropy side, kind of investing along the same side, and that makes sense, right? I mean, I know that if you own Ford stock, what are you doing if you're driving something other than a Ford? So
Right.
that makes sense to try to get a portfolio that's congruent with that family's beliefs. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of the same things. What any kind of final thoughts on where things are headed at the end of this? I'm sure people want to have a way to get in touch with you, so we'll let you do that as well.
Sure.
But kind of any closing thoughts on what you see, what you're hopeful for, or anything that would be insightful to our audience?
Yeah. So let me close with this. When you talk about impact investing, I view it as a coin, and forgive the analogy, but on one side of the coin is this idea of values alignment. On the other side of the coin is this idea of getting capital to areas that need capital. And so what I will tell you is most of the impact space, and there's neither right or wrong here, but they generally, and there's a reason why, because it's typically come from asset managers, they generally are talking about impact investing based on the impact that that the capital has towards the community, towards the environment, towards people. And all that's true. I think there's another side of this coin, this values alignment side, that doesn't get talked about enough. And I'll just tell you anecdotally, when my wife and I started to invest in this way, and I don't want to make this bigger than what it is, but I don't want to underemphasize it as well. There was a joy and a freedom investing this way that I didn't anticipate. And I think it's for two reasons. One, I think it forces you to look at your capital and say, look, I'm going to die at some point. And so, yes, I want to use it for my family's benefit and others' benefits, but I want to impact other people. And then out of that, so you take the focus off of yourself, and then just you read a quarterly report or a semi-annual report, and you not only see the financial results that it's having, but then you read through and hear the stories of how it's impacting people's lives. It's a motivating thing. I mean, I literally just came back an hour ago from a property in Paramore, which, if anybody knows Paramore in Orlando, it's one of the roughest areas. And there was affordable housing that was put in there, and I actually got to see it while it was being developed. You go back there today, it's been open for a year, and there's a ceremony happening there today there. And I asked them, I said, well, is it full? And they're like, oh yeah, it was full like that. I mean, I have heard that there's probably 35,000 units short of affordable housing in Orlando alone. Take that across the United States, and it's massive. And then the impact that has on individuals' lives is obviously, it's astronomical. So what I would tell you is this: whether you are coming at it from a alignment of values, or whether you're coming at it from a pure investment side because you want capital going into areas, I'm totally convinced this is not just a fad. We are seeing the numbers. It's a massive trend. We are set up at Common Good to help advisors because we recognize that there's a lot to learn. It's not as scary as anybody thinks, but it does take some time and commitment. And to me, if I'm an advisor, meeting clients at a deeper level is a win-win all day long. So, and I will say the other thing is because we see it, certain advisors are not, for whatever reason, age, just not interested. And I'm seeing it actually impact business today. Like I said, the last thing I'll say is this week when I was on a call with an advisor, their investor was looking at wanting to go impact. And this investor is interviewing 3 other groups. And they're competing right now on impact. And so that's how this client is going to make the decision. Now, fortunately, I think we can help them and get them up to speed. But that stuff is happening. It's not just, it's a scare tactic. No, we are seeing investors leave advisors to try to find this. And so to the extent that we can help you, or to the extent that you want to learn, and we're glad to help you, whether it's with us or ship you off to other groups, there's just a huge opportunity to connect with clients. And I think that's what's going to be important going forward.
And I appreciate that. You mentioned connecting at a deeper level. I'm thinking back to that 80% statistic of that's the percentage of people that would want to align their investments with their values. Pair that with the generational wealth transfer. And I would think that most savvy advisors would kind of catch on here ahead of the curve to realize if they're going to maintain these relationships when there's this transition, that it's something they're going to have a good focus on. And I was thinking, even from a selfish perspective, that having an impact component gives you two things to be happy about with your investment, right? I mean, it feels good to do the right thing. So instead of being thrilled about the return, you can take some satisfaction from your investments, which usually they're kind of right at arm's length. You don't really think about anything other than the return. So this has been really enlightening. I'm sure that people want to be able to reach out to you. What's the best way? I guess give them the website or your email address, whichever you prefer.
Yeah. So Common Good Cap, CAP for short for capital.com. You can go on there. There's information, or my email is jeff@commongoodcap.com. In closing, here's what it's just a thought to think about. So as an advisor, I think we're all trained that this idea that the market is driven by fear and greed, and this idea of you have to keep your emotions out of investing because otherwise you'll make bad decisions. And while there's a side to that I absolutely agree with, there's another side to that and say, okay, so if emotions are that powerful, yeah, you want to be careful of the greed and fear, but what about the other side? What about this idea of joy? What about this idea of freedom? And so I actually think, done appropriately, bringing in the emotions back into investing is not only an honest statement, because I don't care what you say, you're not taking your emotions out of the investing anyways.
Right.
So you might as well bring in some positive attributes to that. And what may bring you joy could be different than what brings me joy. But here's my challenge to everybody. Whether you invest this way or not, it's okay. But go out and do some research and say, if I had a hypothetical, whatever, $50,000 or whatever, what would I go invest in today? And I think what you'll find if you go do that is you'll be shocked at the unique opportunities. And I think you'll also be shocked to say, wow, capital done well or used well can really have a positive impact. And that's not to say, for complete transparency, that's not to say that if you are not doing impact investing, you're somehow immoral or not a good person. Not at all. I mean, investing is investing, and oh, by the way, most investing has an impact and has a positive impact anyways. They just may not be as deliberate about it. And I think you'll just continue to see that asset managers, whether they want to or not, are going to be forced to, because eventually governments are going to start to say to these companies, we're not going to pay for stuff. We're going to tax you. We're not going to pay for the harm or the things that you're creating. So might as well just get ahead of this and be thinking about a broader stakeholder group for a longer period of time, and you're probably in a great spot.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jeff. Our relationships have an insatiable appetite for education, and you've certainly delivered today. I'm sure you'll be getting some website traffic as a result, and look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. And thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you allowing me to come on and to share with your group. And I would say too, and you did not tell me to say this, I am actually have some of my IRA assets with you all. And so what you guys do from a service perspective in the industry is so critical, because not all IRA custodians hold assets like you do. So you guys are an important piece in this puzzle to democratizing not only alternatives, but then also impact. So appreciate what you guys do as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and we'll talk with you soon.
All right. See ya.
See ya.